talking about this 22 years ago. You know, the terror of affection between men is still something that bedevils Hollywood movies. We can see sex sometimes between men, but the idea of affection between men is something that audiences still are terribly threatened by. A kiss between men on TV or in a mainstream Hollywood film is so rare and so screamed at when it happens. Hasn't changed much. Vito used that lecture about the sissy and fear of homosexuality to begin his lecture for basically 17 years. He started the lecture in 1973. He did this for the rest of his life. And it does bear mentioning, when he did that lecture that you just saw, that was filmed in University of California, Santa Cruz, where he was an adjunct professor just about 8 months before he died. He was, at that point, so ill that when he would teach his classes, he would literally have to grip the podium to be able to remain standing the whole period. But I think, you know, when you look at that, he looks drawn, he looks pale, but you would never know that he's so close to death. His energy there is so enormous because he's still so committed to getting this message out there and communicating to people that the movies matter, and what we see of ourselves in the movies matters totally. It's also worth mentioning that where the lecture started by being about 20 minutes long, by the end of his life, it was 3 hours long. So you're seeing him at the beginning of a 3-hour lecture, which one of his friends, Carla J., who's a very famous lesbian activist and writer, said to him by the end of his life, you know, Vito, you should change the name. It's not the Celluloid closet anymore, it's the Marathon closet. Because if you're doing a lecture that needs an intermission, you know, cut it down a little bit. And of course he wouldn't. He, right to the very end, was still trying to get that message. Even when it was hard for him to speak, he still wanted people to hear what he had to say. Now, in 1981, he took 7 or 8 years of lectures and endless trawling of film archives and endless interviewing of people who knew about gay film and whittled it all down into the book, The Celluloid Closet, which was published by Harper & Row. This was a massive popular hit, and in terms of gay publishing, it was off the charts. It was the book that people had been waiting for 8 to 10 years, as long as they'd been hearing Vito talk about gay films. Because of his lecture, he had a huge built-in audience ready to buy this book, and they did in massive numbers. It's one of the tragedies of Vito's life, or I should say the really frightening coincidences, and there are many of them, that just as the book hit print, literally the week it hit print, this was the week when AIDS was first mentioned in the New York Times. Vito, because he was so plugged in to political circles and artistic circles, gay circles in New York City, knew a disproportionate number of people who were sick. He knew gay people who were dying long before the average person was aware of this. And of course, he was quite horrified by this. And himself, as a sexually active gay man, became very worried about his own health very quickly because he knew that the odds were against him. But as all that was going on, he was also really upset with a trend that was happening in society, which was renewed homophobia. Homophobia had taken a bit of a dip in the late 70s after Anita Bryant had her ugly crusade in 1977. Gays kind of came together and fought that, and there was this resurgence of gay pride and gay power. And there was a sense in the late 70s, right before AIDS, that things were a little bit better. Things were, you know, we had made some progress. And then along comes AIDS, and people are terrified of the disease, which nobody quite knew for sure the cause of, and it gave people an excuse to start attacking gay men again with stronger force and stronger hatred than they'd ever done before. Vito was desperately afraid of this and furious at the trend that he was noticing. And Vito, being Vito, was also particularly noticing it in the movies. In the 80s, there was this rise of what was called the Brat Pack movie, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Movies like Pretty in Pink and St. Elmo's Fire and The Breakfast Club, you know, the movies that starred Molly Ringwald and Judd Nelson, you know, the idols of my youth. And these movies were, for the most part, virulently homophobic. They used the word faggot almost casually. And Vito said when he revised The Celluloid Closet in 1987, he was furious to note that the word faggot seemed to be mandatory in Hollywood movies, especially movies that were targeted to kids. This especially upset Vito because he thought that this was teaching children to have prejudices, teaching children that it was okay, in fact it was funny, to use the word faggot, and you could get social validation, you could get a Hollywood movie doing this, and this really upset him. it upset him so much that he revised the book and included a whole new chapter dedicated largely to this trend. Now, also as this was going on, he found the man he called the love of his life, who was a very gentle poet from San Francisco named Jeff Sevchik. Jeffrey got AIDS in 1985, and as he was getting sick, as Jeffrey was falling ill, Vito realized that he himself was ill. He found a Kaposi's sarcoma lesion on his leg, and he knew that this was his own disease. And I want to show you a clip here of Vito describing what it was like to realize that he had AIDS in this context. This clip comes from the documentary Common Threads, which some of you may be familiar with as the first documentary on the AIDS quilt. So let's take a look at this.
Noticing that there was a dark spot on the back of my knee, like inside the hollow behind. And I noticed it, you know, I think most people did by accident. You know, I just looked and there it was. And I couldn't lie to myself. I wasn't, because I was more sophisticated about this disease than I think the average person, and I knew immediately what I was seeing. And of course you hope that it's not. I mean, everybody does. But I immediately made an appointment to see my doctor in New York. The phone rang, and it was my doctor in New York, and he said, I can't believe this, but the biopsy came back negative. It was a mole. And it was incredible. I mean, just incredible to hear this news, that in fact it was not KS. And 2 days passed, and again, the phone rang. At the AIDS Foundation, was my doctor, and he said, I will never, ever be able to make this up to you. He said, I don't know how to tell you this, but the lab switched your slide with the slide of an 86-year-old heterosexual woman who has gotten a KS diagnosis, which is not possible. So I'm sorry to tell you this, but it turns out it's positive after all, and you do have KS. And at that point, I sort of felt like, you know, Susan Haywood and I Want to Live, you know, with the governor giving her a pardon every 5 minutes and then the phone ringing. It just drives you nuts. You know, the stress was enormous.